Yara Gambarasio. In the late autumn of 2010, in a small Italian town near Bergamo, a young rhythmic gymnast walked out of her gym on a Friday evening to drop off a stereo for an upcoming competition. She lived just minutes away. She never made the walk home. The case that followed would become the largest forensic operation in Italian history, would cost millions of euros, would test the DNA of more than 20,000 people, and would crack open a hidden family secret that had been buried for decades. Yara Gambarasio was a 13-year-old gymnast from Brembate di Sopra, a small post-war satellite town in Italy's Lombardy region. She was the daughter of a quantity surveyor. She lived just 700 meters from the gymnastics center she attended. On the evening of Friday, November 26, 2010, she was last seen leaving her gym at 6:44 in the evening. The walk should have taken her 10 minutes. She never made it. How does an entire community lose a 13-year-old girl on a familiar walk in a town this small, with no witnesses, no leads, and no suspect for months? A massive search began that night. It would last 3 months. On February 26, 2011, a man flying a remote-controlled airplane in a field in Cignolo di Sola, about 10 kilometers from her home, discovered her body. She had been left in the open. The cause of death was determined to be a combination of a head blow, non-lethal cuts, and exposure to the cold. Forensic scientists then made the discovery that would change the entire investigation. They recovered a male DNA trace from the victim's clothing. Italian investigators, led by prosecutor Letizia Ruggeri, gave the unknown contributor a name. They called him Ignoto Uno, or Unknown One. They then launched something that had never been done at this scale in Italian history: a DNA dragnet that would ultimately collect and compare roughly 22,000 to 25,700 DNA samples over the next 3 years. Investigators went to schools, factories, and small towns, asking thousands of men to voluntarily provide a sample. After years of testing, a young man named Damiano Guarinoni was identified as a partial match. He was not the killer, but he was related to him. By tracing the family tree, investigators determined that Ignoto Uno was the son of Damiano's deceased uncle, a bus driver named Giuseppe Guarinoni. Giuseppe had died in 1999. To confirm the connection, investigators tested DNA recovered from the back of a postage stamp Giuseppe Guarinoni had licked decades earlier. The match was confirmed. But because Giuseppe had been dead for over a decade, the killer had to be one of his children. What investigators discovered next was a hidden family secret no one had ever spoken about. By mass testing women who had known Giuseppe Guarinoni in life, a woman named Esther Arzuffi was identified through mitochondrial DNA as the mother of Ignoto Uno. Esther had been married to a different man, Giovanni Bossetti, since 1967. DNA proved that her twin children, born in 1970, were not Giovanni's children at all. They were the secret children of Giuseppe Guarinoni. In June 2014, investigators set up a fake breathalyzer roadblock to surreptitiously obtain DNA from one of those twins. DNA collected from Massimo Giuseppe Bossetti's breathalyzer mouthpiece confirmed the match. Massimo Giuseppe Bossetti, a 43-year-old married construction worker from Mappello with 3 children of his own, was arrested on June 16, 2014. He has consistently maintained his innocence, claiming the DNA was contaminated, fabricated, or transferred via stolen tools. Bossetti was sentenced to life imprisonment by the court of Bergamo on July 1, 2016. The verdict was upheld on appeal in July 2017 and confirmed by Italy's Court of Cassation on October 12, 2018. He has been incarcerated at Bollati prison ever since. In 2024, Netflix released a 5-part docu-series about the case. In June 2025, an Italian court granted Bossetti's defense access to the original DNA evidence for the first time. The case is considered closed in Italian courts, but the DNA evidence remains a subject of public debate. The next case takes us to a small wooded property in New Hampshire, where 2 rusting metal barrels would hide one of the most disturbing serial killings of the late 20th century. Bear Brook Murders. In November 1985, a hunter walking through a wooded property next to Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, came across an old 55-gallon metal barrel sitting in the trees. Inside the barrel were the remains of 2 people, a woman and a young child. 15 years later, in May 2000, a second barrel would be found just 300 feet away, holding the remains of 2 more children. The 4 victims had no names. They had no missing persons reports. For more than 30 years, no one knew who they were. The case that finally solved them would launch the entire era of forensic genetic genealogy. The first barrel was discovered on November 10, 1985. The second was found just 300 feet away on May 9, 2000. All 4 victims had been killed. Authorities believed they had been killed somewhere between 1978 and 1981. For 33 years, the case remained one of the most haunting unidentified victims investigations in New England. Police had no names, no missing persons reports, and no suspect. How does a killer leave behind 4 people in barrels in the woods in a small New Hampshire town and walk away unknown for more than 3 decades? The breakthrough came from one of the most extraordinary careers in modern forensic science. Genetic genealogist Dr. Barbara Ray Venter, working with San Bernardino County Sheriff's investigator Peter Headley, had earlier identified an abducted child known only as Lisa by tracing her family through commercial genealogy databases. It was the first known criminal application of investigative genetic genealogy. That trail led her to Lisa's abductor, a serial alias swapping man who had moved through the country under at least 5 different names. In June 2017, Y chromosome DNA testing using a sample from one of his children from his first marriage confirmed that the man who had been calling himself Bob Evans in New Hampshire was actually a Denver-born drifter named Terry Peter Rasmussen. The press eventually nicknamed him the Chameleon Killer. Rasmussen had lived in Manchester, New Hampshire, under the Bob Evans alias. During the same period, the 4 victims had likely been killed. Investigators were now sure they had found the killer. But they still did not know who the 4 victims were. Dr. Ray Venter then turned the same techniques on the victims themselves. The challenge was extreme. The bones of the 4 victims had been infiltrated by bacterial DNA over decades, forcing scientists to extract autosomal DNA from rootless hair samples, a technique that had previously been thought impossible. An independent citizen sleuth named Becky Heath simultaneously cracked the lead. On June 5, 2019, New Hampshire authorities announced the identification of 3 of the 4 victims. The 3 were Marlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, an adult mother last seen leaving a Thanksgiving dinner in Southern California in November 1978 in the company of Terry Rasmussen, and her 2 daughters, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters. The 4th victim, known only as the middle child, remained unnamed for several more years. She did not appear to be biologically related to Marlise. In 2024 and 2025, the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit partnered with the DNA Doe Project to finally identify her. The team traced ancestors back to a couple born in the 1870s, then forward to a 2005 obituary that mentioned a daughter named Pepper Reed. On September 5, 2025, Rhea Rasmussen was officially confirmed as the final victim. She had been the killer's own biological daughter, born in 1976 in Orange County, California. Her mother, Pepper Reed, has not been seen since the late 1970s. Terry Peter Rasmussen had already passed away in a California prison of natural causes in 2010, at which point he had been serving a life sentence under yet another alias for the killing of a different woman in California. He was never charged with the Bear Brook killings. New Hampshire Attorney General John Formella stated in September 2025 that with Rhea Rasmussen's identification, all 4 victims now have their names back. The next case takes us to a wintry stretch of road outside Denver, Colorado, where a young woman from Wyoming hitchhiked toward a county jail to visit her boyfriend. Terry Becker. In December 1975, a young woman from Casper, Wyoming, was last seen hitchhiking to Brighton, Colorado, on her way to visit her boyfriend at the Adams County Jail. 2 days later, 2 passing motorcyclists discovered her body in a field in Westminster, Colorado, just north of Denver. Her clothing and personal items were scattered nearby. The case would sit cold for nearly 50 years. The killer would die before investigators ever knew his name. And the only way to confirm his identity would be to dig up his body. Terry Becker was a 20-year-old Casper native and a graduate of Kelly Walsh High School. She had worked at a Denver area newspaper called the Golden Bell Press before moving to the area shortly after graduation. Her family later described her as a free spirit who lived life on the edge, never met a stranger, painted, and loved Three Dog Night and Steppenwolf. On December 4, 1975, she was last seen hitchhiking to Brighton, Colorado, to visit her boyfriend at the Adams County Jail. She never made the trip. How does a young woman go missing on a stretch of Colorado road in the middle of winter, end up in a field 10 miles north of Denver, and stay nameless for nearly 50 years? 2 days later, on December 6, 1975, 2 passing motorcyclists discovered her body in a field near 100th Avenue and Lowell Boulevard in Westminster. The autopsy determined she had been harmed and that the cause of death was asphyxiation. The case was reviewed multiple times over the decades. In 2003, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation extracted male DNA from a piece of evidence and entered the profile into the National CODIS database. There was no match. The first real break in the case did not come until 2013. In that year, the same Colorado profile matched a sample uploaded by Las Vegas Metro Police from the 1991 rape and killing of a woman in a Las Vegas apartment. The match confirmed something investigators had not known. The same person had killed Terry in Colorado in 1975 and a second woman in Las Vegas 16 years later. But the offender himself remained unknown. In 2018, the profile was deemed a strong candidate for the new science of investigative genetic genealogy. Over the next 5 years, the Westminster Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the genetic genealogy company Parabon Nanolabs, and a Denver-based group called Solved by DNA painstakingly built a family tree from the unknown DNA profile. The work was unusually difficult. Tracing the suspect's lineage was complicated because his parents had divorced and he had been adopted by his stepfather, whose surname he had carried his entire life. The family tree did not match the surname. In October 2023, with funding from a volunteer group called the Vegas Justice League, Las Vegas Metro Police obtained official consent to exhume the suspect's body from Southern Nevada Veterans Memorial Cemetery. 2 Westminster police officers traveled to Las Vegas to witness the exhumation. In December 2023, the bones tested as a match to the original DNA profile from Terry's case. The man identified was Thomas Martin Elliott, born December 14, 1950. He was a career criminal. Born to a man named Walter Graham and a woman named Nancy West. He had been adopted by a stepfather and had carried that stepfather's surname his entire life. That single fact, the adopted surname, was the reason genealogists could not trace him through any conventional family tree. He had served 6 years for a Lakewood, Colorado burglary committed before Terry's death. He was released in Las Vegas in 1981, then convicted of another offense and sentenced to 10 more years. He was released again in 1991. He was the man who killed the woman in Las Vegas that same year. He took his own life on October 30th, 1991. The case was officially solved and announced in early 2024. No prosecution was possible. Westminster police are now using the breakthrough to re-examine 10 other cold cases. The next case takes us to North Carolina, to a quiet hardware store where a young mother went out for lunch and never came back. Mary Davis. On a spring afternoon in 1987, a married mother of 2 who worked at a small-town hardware store in North Carolina left for her lunch break. She told no one anything was wrong. She had a daughter waiting at home. Her body would be found the next morning behind a local grocery store. The case would sit cold for 35 years. The killer would never end up in a police database. And the only thing that would finally identify him was a new technology that did not exist when she died. Mary Mathis Davis was a 29-year-old married mother of 2 living in Lexington, North Carolina. She worked at Lanier's Hardware in town. She was the wife of Richard Davis. She was the mother of a daughter named Tracy. She was, by every account, a woman whose life was ordinary in the best possible sense, anchored to her family and to her job. How does an ordinary woman on an ordinary lunch break in a small southern town vanish in broad daylight and go 35 years without an answer? On the afternoon of May 30th, 1987, Mary Davis left for lunch from her job at Lanier's Hardware and never returned. Her body was found the next morning, May 31st, 1987, behind 802 East Center Street in Lexington. At the time, that address was the location of a Winn-Dixie grocery store. Investigators determined she had been kidnapped, harmed, and asphyxiated. Detectives collected biological evidence at the scene in 1987. They preserved it carefully. They knew the technology of the time was not enough. The case remained open for more than 35 years with no viable suspect. Decades passed. Detectives changed. Lab equipment changed. Mary's daughter grew up. Her parents grew older. The case stayed exactly where it had been on the morning her body had been found. The break came in 2022. The Lexington Police Department resubmitted the original physical evidence from the case, partnering with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation and a private genetic genealogy company called Othram Incorporated, based in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram is one of the leading commercial labs in the new field of forensic genealogy. Their scientists used a proprietary process they call forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive DNA profile from the degraded male DNA recovered in 1987. Othrum's in-house genealogy team then produced investigative leads. Lexington detectives followed those leads for months. By early 2023, they had a name. The man identified was Russell Grant Wood of Lexington, North Carolina. He had been 3 years younger than Mary at the time of her death. He had been an acquaintance. He was the kind of person no one had ever flagged. He had no prior criminal record. He had no entries in any law enforcement database. He had not been on any list of suspects. The reason Mary's case had gone unsolved for 35 years was simple. Conventional CODIS-based DNA matching is only useful when the suspect's DNA is already in a database. Wood's DNA had never been in any database. He had lived his entire life without ever being arrested for anything. Russell Grant Wood died in 2013 at the age of 58, 9 years before the breakthrough that would finally name him as the man responsible for Mary's death. His motive remains unknown. Davidson County District Attorney Gary Frank issued a formal letter stating that if Wood had still been alive, he would have been indicted on first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, and additional charges. The case stands as a textbook example of why investigative genetic genealogy has changed the way modern detectives work. The technique works precisely because it does not require the suspect's DNA to be on file. It works by tracing the suspect's distant cousins through profiles voluntarily uploaded to commercial genealogy databases, then narrowing down the family tree until only one candidate remains. The case was officially closed and announced on February 7, 2023. No prosecution was possible. Mary's family released doves in her memory at Forest Hill Memorial Park in Lexington on February 12, 2023, on what would have been her 65th birthday. Her daughter Tracy, who had grown up without her, finally had an answer to a question that had defined her life for 35 years. The next case takes us back to early 1960s Boston, where 13 single women were attacked in their own apartments by a killer the press would name the Boston Strangler. The Boston Strangler. Between June 1962 and January 1964, 13 single women in the Boston area were attacked in their own apartments. The press named him the Silk Stocking Strangler, then the Mad Strangler, and finally simply the Boston Strangler. One man, a Massachusetts laborer named Albert DeSalvo, eventually confessed to all 13. He was never tried for the killings. He was stabbed to death in prison before any trial could happen. For nearly 50 years afterward, criminologists, profilers, and authors argued that DeSalvo had not done it, or at least had not done all of it. The answer would not come until forensic science finally caught up with the crime. Between June 14, 1962 and January 4, 1964, 13 single women in the Boston area were killed. The victims included Anna Sleezers, Helen Blake, Ida Erga, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Beverly Simmons, and finally a 19-year-old woman named Mary Sullivan. Mary was a 1962 graduate of Barnstable High School from Cape Cod. She had moved into her Beacon Hill apartment on Charles Street just 4 days before she was attacked there on January 4, 1964. A handwritten Happy New Year card had been left propped against her left foot. How does a single killer, or possibly several killers, attack 13 women across a major American city for nearly 2 years, then simply stop? With the case never reaching a courtroom, Albert DeSalvo a Chelsea, Massachusetts laborer born in 1931, confessed to all 13 attacks in 1965 to a fellow Bridgewater State Hospital inmate named George Nassar. Nassar alerted attorney F. Lee Bailey. Police were impressed by the details DeSalvo could recall. But there was a problem. No physical evidence had ever connected him to any of the killings. He was eventually convicted only of a separate series of unrelated offenses called the Green Man cases and was sentenced to life in 1967. He recanted his strangler confession before being stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole Prison on November 25, 1973. For nearly 50 years, the case remained in dispute. Criminologists, profilers, including the legendary FBI agent Robert Ressler, and authors like Susan Kelly argued that the killings had been the work of multiple people, and that DeSalvo had been coached by Nassar to confess in exchange for a possible book deal. The breakthrough came from evidence that had been quietly preserved by a careful Boston Police Crime Lab scientist. Robert Hayes had kept 6 seminal fluid samples lifted from Mary Sullivan's body and from a maroon blanket at her apartment for nearly 50 years. Using federal funding awarded to Boston in 2009 and again in 2012, the BPD Cold Case Squad applied a technique called YSTR-DNA analysis. YSTR analysis profiles the male line Y chromosome, which is passed virtually unchanged from father to son to grandson. It allows investigators to trace male relatives without ever directly testing the suspect. Boston Police Sergeant Brian Albert tailed DeSalvo's nephew, Tim DeSalvo, to a Boston construction site. He recovered a discarded water bottle. YSTR testing on the bottle produced a near certain familial match, excluding 99.9% of the population, to the seminal fluid from Mary Sullivan's apartment. A judge then ordered exhumation. On July 11, 2013, Suffolk County District Attorney Daniel Conley announced the familial match. On July 19, 2013, after DeSalvo's body had been exhumed, Massachusetts Attorney General Martha Coakley announced a direct DNA match. She declared the result left no doubt that DeSalvo had been responsible for the death of Mary Sullivan. The case is, in important ways, only partly closed. DeSalvo is now conclusively linked only to Mary Sullivan. The other 12 cases are technically still open. Many investigators continue to believe multiple killers were involved. WBZ-TV's I-Team has continued to follow the broader investigation through 2024 and into 2025. A Springfield, Massachusetts resident named David Robitaille has pushed evidence pointing to George Nassar himself as a possible additional offender. Nassar, still alive and serving life for a separate killing, denies any involvement. The case received renewed pop culture attention in 2023 with the release of Hulu's film Boston Strangler, starring Keira Knightley and Carrie Coon as record American journalists Loretta McLaughlin and Gene Cole, the 2 reporters who had given the killer his famous nickname in the early 1960s. The film's epilogue notes the 2013 DNA confirmation. No new exhumations or DNA tests on the other 12 victims have been publicly announced as of late 2025. The Boston Police Department has continued to call the case open. For the family of Mary Sullivan, the 2013 confirmation provided the only answer they had ever received in 50 years. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. The next case takes us to a quiet rural road in Central Florida. where a sixth-grade band student stepped off her school bus on a Friday afternoon and walked toward a faded blue pickup truck. Jennifer Odom. On a Friday afternoon in February 1993, a sixth-grade clarinet player in rural Pasco County, Florida, stepped off her school bus at the end of the day. Her mother had driven behind the bus that morning so the two could wave at each other through the window. The walk from the bus stop to her front door was only 200 yards. Classmates watched her start that walk. They also watched a faded blue pickup truck slowly follow her down the road. She never made it home. The case would sit cold for 30 years. The man eventually arrested for it would be exposed by the DNA of his own son. Jennifer Renee Odom was a sixth grader who lived in the rural St. Joseph area of northeastern Pasco County, Florida, near Dade City. She played clarinet in her school band. Her mother, Renee Converse, often drove behind the school bus in the mornings just so they could wave at each other through the window. Around 3 o'clock on the afternoon of Friday, February 19th, 1993, Jennifer stepped off her school bus, waved goodbye to her friends, and started the 200-yard walk to her home. How does a young girl on a familiar walk, in clear daylight, with classmates watching from a school bus, end up vanishing without a trace? Classmates on the bus reported seeing a faded blue pickup truck slowly following her down the road. A massive manhunt ensued. Every Tampa Bay area law enforcement agency joined the search. 6 days later, on February 25, 1993, her body was discovered in an abandoned orange grove in southern Hernando County near Brooksville. Her clothes, including a red sweater and a Hooters jacket, were missing. In January 1995, almost 2 years later, a couple hunting for scrap metal in western Hernando County found her missing book bag and clarinet case, with fingerprints still on the case. The Hernando County Sheriff's Office accumulated a 75,000-page case file with thousands of leads. The case was featured on a 1994 episode of Unsolved Mysteries. No suspect was ever named publicly for 30 years. The break in the case came from a different crime entirely. 13 months before Jennifer was killed, on January 16, 1992, a 17-year-old special education student at Land O'Lakes High School had been abducted after stepping off her school bus in Pasco County. She had been brutally attacked and left for dead. She survived, but was paralyzed on her left side. Biological evidence in that 1992 case sat in storage for years without a CODIS match. Then, in 2015, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement used familial DNA searching of state databases. The unknown DNA matched a young man whose own DNA was on file because of a separate criminal conviction. He was the son of a man named Jeffrey Norman Crum. That match led directly to Crum's arrest in 2015 for the 1992 attack. He was sentenced to 2 life terms in 2019. Because the methods of the 2 crimes were almost identical, both victims abducted from a school bus, Crum became the immediate prime suspect in the Odom case. According to court documents released in August 2025, Crum allegedly confessed the Odom killing to his own son, telling him he sees demons at night, and to a woman he later kidnapped. He stated that he had held Jennifer at his home before harming her. Jeffrey Norman Crum, born in 1962, was a drywall worker who had lived in Pasco County in 1993 and had driven a faded blue pickup truck. A grand jury indicted him on July 24, 2023. His arrest was announced on July 27, 2023. Florida State Attorney Bill Gladson announced he would seek the death penalty. Crum is currently held without bond at the Hernando County Detention Center, while continuing to serve his 2 existing life sentences. As of late February 2025, his trial was set for the August 2025 docket. The next case takes us to 1970 Maryland, where a high school junior drove to a local mall on a Friday night to buy shoe polish for the next day's homecoming dance. Pamela Lynn Conyers. On a Friday evening in October 1970, a 16-year-old high school junior in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, drove her family's car to a local shopping mall. She was looking for shoe polish for the next night's homecoming dance. She told her mother she would be home soon. She never came back. Her car was found 3 days later in a wooded area still under construction. Her body was found nearby. The case would sit cold for 53 years. When it was finally cracked, 2 different men, both already dead, were identified as the people responsible. Pamela Lynn Conyers was a junior at Glen Burnie High School in Anne Arundel County, Maryland. She played flute in the school band. Friends remembered her as the girl next door. On the evening of Friday, October 16, 1970, Pamela attended Glen Burnie High School's homecoming bonfire and pep rally, then went home and spoke briefly with her mother. Around 8:30 that night, she drove her family's 1967 Dodge Monaco to the Herondale Mall in Glen Burnie to buy shoe polish for the next night's homecoming dance. She never came home. How does a careful, family-oriented teenager drive to a busy local mall on a Friday night, disappear, and leave a case so quiet that 53 years pass before her family ever hears the name of the man responsible? 3 days later, police found the Monaco abandoned in a wooded area near Mountain Road and what would later become Route 100. The area was, at the time, under heavy construction. On Tuesday, October 20th, 1970, Pamela's body was found a short distance from the car. She had been harmed and asphyxiated. Investigators preserved the physical evidence carefully. They preserved DNA from cigarette butts found inside the car. They preserved a latent palm print recovered from the outside of the car. Despite extensive efforts, the case stalled. At one point, investigators wondered whether Pamela's death was tied to 2 other unsolved cases also linked to the same Herondale Mall. The 1969 death of Sister Kathy Sesnick, the case at the heart of the Netflix series The Keepers, and the 1969 disappearance of a young woman named Joyce Malecki. No connection was ever proven. The Conyers case went cold for over 50 years. The breakthrough came in March 2023. The Anne Arundel County Police Department submitted forensic evidence to Othram Incorporated in the Woodlands, Texas. Othram developed a comprehensive DNA profile via its proprietary forensic-grade genome sequencing process. The profile was then handed to the FBI's investigative genetic genealogy team, which used publicly accessible genealogy databases and open-source records to construct family trees and identify the suspect. On March 10, 2023, investigators announced the identification of Forrest Clyde Williams III. Williams had been a drifter who had moved to Pasadena, Maryland, as a teenager and had attended Northeast High School, then worked carpentry side jobs before returning to Virginia. His DNA had been on the cigarette butts found inside Pamela's car. His latent palm print had been on the outside. He had died in Salem, Virginia, in 2018 at the age of 69. Anne Arundel County had only minor priors on him. But the case did not stop there. Investigators believed there had been a second person involved. Exactly 1 year later, on March 18, 2024, a second man was identified. His name was Donald Willard. He had been a handyman who lived in Pasadena in 1970 and had worked for a local contracting company called Hoverhill Contracting on the same Route 100 construction project where Pamela's body was found. He had died in Montgomery County, Maryland in 2010. His DNA was also recovered from the cigarettes inside her car. Both men had been hunters. Both men had frequented a local establishment called the Mountain Bar. Anne Arundel County Police Chief Amala Wad said in March 2023, "Pamela was never forgotten, nor will she ever be forgotten." Police are continuing to ask the public for information on whether either man might be tied to other unsolved crimes. Neither prosecution will happen. The next case takes us across the Atlantic to 1967 Bristol, England, where a quiet 75-year-old widow returned home from visiting her best friend and locked the door behind her. Louisa Dunn. On a summer evening in 1967, in the Easton neighborhood of Bristol, England, a quiet, twice-widowed pensioner walked home from her best friend's house in good spirits. That night, neighbors heard a frightening, muffled scream from her house. The next morning, her body was found inside. The Bristol police would collect 19,000 fingerprints. They would knock on doors. They would do everything they could. The case would go cold for 58 years. The man eventually convicted would be 92 years old at the time of his trial. It would become one of the oldest cold cases ever solved by DNA in the United Kingdom. Louisa Dunn was a 75-year-old twice-widowed pensioner living alone at 58 Britannia Road, Easton, Bristol. She had been born in 1892. As a young woman, she had been active in the early labor movement. Her first husband had been a Bristol alderman and a leading figure in the Labour Party before his death in 1945. Her second husband, an Irish-born night watchman for the Bristol Corporation, had passed away around 1961. She lived modestly on her old-age pension. Her treasured possessions were her books and the deeds to her own home. Her best friend of 30 years was a woman named Alice Clark, whom she visited every week. How does a small Bristol neighborhood lose one of its quietest residents in her own home, with the police collecting 19,000 fingerprints, and not know who was responsible for nearly 6 decades? On the evening of June 27th, 1967, Louisa visited Mrs. Clark from about 5:20 in the afternoon and left in good spirits. That night, neighbors heard a muffled scream and crying out lasting several seconds from inside her house. The next morning, June 28th, 1967, a neighbor noticed her sash window was unusually open. She found Louisa's body lying on the floor of her living room. She had been harmed and asphyxiated. The intruder had broken in through a rear window. Bristol police collected approximately 19,000 fingerprints and palm prints from men and boys in the area, but identified no suspect. House-to-house inquiries did not extend to the property where the killer had moved, just outside the search perimeter. Crucially, investigators preserved Louisa's blue skirt and a partial palm print recovered from the rear window. The case went cold for 56 years. In 2023, the Avon and Somerset Police Major Crime Review Team reopened the case. In May 2024, cuttings from the preserved blue skirt were sent for forensic testing. The result was extraordinary. A full DNA profile was obtained that was, in court testimony, 1 billion times more likely to belong to Ryland Headley than to anyone else. The match was possible because Headley's DNA had been added to the United Kingdom's National DNA Database in 2012, following an unrelated arrest. 4 independent experts also matched the original 1967 palm print to Headley. He was arrested in November 2024. Ryland Headley, 92 at the time of his conviction and 34 at the time of the killing, lived in Clarence Road, Ipswich. After Louise's death, he had moved to a property just beyond the original search perimeter, then settled in Ipswich and worked as a railway machinist. Between 1973 and 1978, he had committed at least 10 Ipswich burglaries. In 1977, he had been convicted of attacks on 2 elderly women in Ipswich and originally sentenced to life imprisonment. But his sentence was reduced to 7 years on appeal. Headley's trial began at Bristol Crown Court on June 16, 2025. He pleaded not guilty. On June 30, 2025, the jury convicted him. On July 1, 2025, Mr. Justice Derek Sweeting sentenced Headley to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. The judge told him the sentence meant he would die in prison. Following the conviction, Avon and Somerset, Suffolk, Norfolk Police, and the National Crime Agency began reviewing other unsolved cases from the 1970s and 1980s to determine if Headley is responsible for further offenses. The next case takes us to a quiet stretch of country road in Wisconsin where a young Minneapolis artist hitchhiking to an art show in Chicago would never make it past Eau Claire. Mary Kay Schleys. On a winter morning in February 1974, a young art student from the University of Minnesota left her Minneapolis home to hitchhike to an art show in Chicago. She was 25 years old. She was an honors graduate. She was enrolled in a Master of Fine Arts program. By midday, an eyewitness in rural Wisconsin would watch a man dump her body in a snowbank beside an orange car and drive away. He would leave behind a single piece of physical evidence, a black and orange stocking cap. The case would sit cold for 50 years. The cap would be the only thing that ever solved it. Mary Kay Schleys was a 25-year-old Minneapolis resident, a University of Minnesota honors graduate enrolled in a Master of Fine Arts program. She was a gifted artist, an equestrian, a scholar, and a world traveler. Her family later remembered her as someone who lived in motion. Her brother Don Schleys survived her. So did her niece Nina Mary Schleys, who would later be born after Mary's death. On the morning of Friday, February 15, 1974, Mary left her uptown Minneapolis home to hitchhike to an art show in Chicago. Just hours later, around midday, an eyewitness saw a man and a woman struggling beside a small orange or gold compact car, parked at the side of a dead-end road in Springbrook Township, Dunn County, Wisconsin. The location was about 8 miles west of Eau Claire and 90 miles from Mary's home. The witness watched as the man dumped a body in a snowbank and fled. How does a young woman in motion, with friends and family expecting her, end up in a snowbank in rural Wisconsin? With a single eyewitness and a case that sits cold for 50 years? Mary's purse and fur coat were missing. The killer had left behind a black and orange stocking cap at the scene. Hairs in the cap did not belong to Mary. Investigators preserved the cap as evidence. The case went cold for decades despite numerous tips. Mary's body was even exhumed in 2009 for additional forensic examination. A 2011 lead briefly pointed to a different person who had been traveling through the area, but he was never charged. In the fall of 2022, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office partnered with the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center at Ramapo College in Mahwah, New Jersey, led by Director David Gurney and Associate Director Karen Binder. DNA from the cap's hairs was uploaded to genealogy databases in the spring of 2023. The closest initial match was a first or second cousin in Montana. Tracking the family tree was unusually difficult because the suspect, a man named John Keith Miller, had been adopted, masking his biological lineage. The team had to eliminate each known family member before concluding that there must have been an adoption somewhere in the tree. Investigators eventually obtained a DNA sample from Miller's biological daughter, which confirmed her parent was the source of the cap's DNA. On November 7th, 2024, Dunn County investigators arrived at John Keith Miller's apartment in an Owatonna, Minnesota assisted living facility. Miller, 84, opened the door and reportedly said, "I knew why you were here." He confessed in detail. He told investigators that he had picked Mary up while she was hitchhiking that day. He said he had asked her for sex. He said that when she refused, he had grabbed a knife stowed in the visor of his car and harmed her as she leaned forward. He admitted he had tried to hide her body in a snowbank, but had fled when another car drove by. He admitted the stocking cap was his. In a February 2025 jailhouse interview with CARE 11, Miller said he had also disposed of the murder weapon in a swamp near where he had once lived. Miller, born in Minnesota, had a long prior criminal record. It included a forgery conviction in the late 1950s, a 1965 armed robbery conviction in Flagstaff, Arizona, and a stint in California's San Quentin prison until 1972. The Schley's case occurred less than 2 years after his release from San Quentin. On March 27, 2025, Miller entered a no-contest plea before Dunn County Circuit Court Judge James Peterson and was sentenced to mandatory life imprisonment, plus restitution. Niece Nina Mary Schley's told the court that Mary had been a brilliant, independent woman, a gifted artist, an equestrian, a world traveler, and a scholar. Miller is currently serving his life sentence at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. The Schley's family has pledged to donate the restitution funds to Ramapo College's Investigative Genetic Genealogy Center, the same academic program that finally identified the man who had killed Mary 50 years earlier. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.